Officer Rick Thompson had been driving around Riverside Heights for about 2 hours that Tuesday evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. This was the kind of neighborhood where houses cost more than what Rick made in 5 years. Big lawns, fancy cars and driveways, and streets so clean you could eat off them. Rick had been a cop for 15 years now. He thought he knew the streets like the back of his hand. He knew which cars belonged and which ones didn't. At least that's what he told himself. The truth was, Rick had some pretty strong ideas about who belonged where. And those ideas weren't always fair. As he drove down Maple Street, something caught his eye. A black BMW with dark windows was driving slowly, like the driver was looking for an address. The car was nice, really nice. Probably cost more than Rick's house, but it wasn't the car that bothered Rick. It was the driver. Through the windshield, Rick could see a black man behind the wheel. The man was dressed well, wearing what looked like an expensive suit. But Rick's mind didn't go to successful businessman or lawyer heading home from work. Instead, he started thinking about all the wrong reasons someone might be in this neighborhood. Rick slowed his patrol car and began following the BMW at a distance. The driver wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't weaving. He came to complete stops at stop signs and used his turn signals. But Rick kept following anyway. The BMW turned left onto Oak Avenue, one of the most expensive streets in the area. Rick's suspicion grew stronger. What was this guy doing here? Rick had convinced himself that someone like this man couldn't possibly belong in a neighborhood like this. Not unless he was up to something. Rick picked up his radio and called it in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm following a suspicious vehicle in Riverside Heights. Black BMW license plate." He squinted to read the numbers and letters. The car was clean and the plates were clearly visible, but Rick was looking for any excuse to make a stop. The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Any traffic violations, Officer Thompson?" Rick paused. He had to be honest. Negative. But the vehicle seems out of place in this area. There was silence on the radio for a moment. The dispatcher had heard this kind of call before. "Understood, Unit 47, keep us posted." Rick continued following the BMW. The driver seemed to know where he was going now. He turned into the parking lot of Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant that Rick had never been able to afford. The kind of place where a single meal cost what Rick spent on groceries for a week. The BMW parked in a space near the front of the restaurant. Rick could see the driver checking his phone and adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. Everything about the man's behavior suggested he was just someone getting ready for dinner. But Rick's prejudices were stronger than his common sense. Rick had grown up in a different part of town. A rougher area where trust was hard to come by and everyone looked out for themselves. Over the years, he'd developed a worldview that put people into boxes. And once someone was in a box in Rick's mind, it was hard for them to get out. The truth was, Rick felt out of place in neighborhoods like Riverside Heights too. When he patrolled these streets, he felt like people looked down on him. Like they saw him as just another working-class guy who wasn't good enough for their world. And instead of dealing with those feelings, Rick turned them outward. He looked for reasons to prove that other people didn't belong either. As Rick watched the BMW, he made up his mind. He was going to find a reason to pull this car over. Even if the driver wasn't doing anything wrong now, Rick was sure he could find something. Maybe the windows were too dark. Maybe there was an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. There was always something. Rick positioned his patrol car where he could see the BMW clearly. The driver was still sitting in his car, probably waiting for someone or maybe just taking a moment before going into the restaurant. Rick decided this was his chance. He turned on his overhead lights and hit the siren once, just a quick chirp to get the driver's attention. The blue and red lights reflected off the BMW's dark paint, creating a light show in the restaurant parking lot. Through his windshield, Rick could see the driver's reaction. The man looked in his rearview mirror, then around the parking lot, probably wondering if the police car was there for him. When he realized it was, Rick saw him take a deep breath and put both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Rick felt a familiar rush of authority as he stepped out of his patrol car. This was the part of the job he liked most, the moment when he was in complete control. He straightened his uniform and checked that his body camera was recording, though he wasn't too worried about that. In his experience, traffic stops like this rarely led to complaints that went anywhere. As he walked toward the BMW, Rick was already planning what he was going to say. He'd start with asking for license and registration, even though he didn't have a real reason for the stop. Then he'd find something to be suspicious about. Maybe he'd smell something that wasn't there. Maybe he'd claim the driver was acting nervous. There were lots of ways to turn a simple traffic stop into something bigger. The driver remained perfectly still as Rick approached. His hand stayed on the steering wheel, and he waited for Rick to reach the window before making any movements. This was clearly someone who knew how to handle a traffic stop, which only made Rick more suspicious. Rick had made hundreds of traffic stops over the years. Most of them were routine, speeding tickets, broken taillights, things like that. But some of them were different. Some of them were about more than just enforcing traffic laws. They were about showing certain people that they needed to stay in their place. As Rick reached the driver's window, he already knew how this was going to go. He'd be tough, maybe a little rough around the edges. He'd ask hard questions and act like every answer was suspicious. He'd take his time, make the driver sweat a little. Show him that this wasn't his neighborhood and he better remember that. What Rick didn't know was that this traffic stop was about to change his life forever. The man sitting behind the wheel of that BMW wasn't just any driver. He was someone who had the power to end Rick's career with a single phone call. But Rick wouldn't find that out until it was too late to take back the words he was about to say and the actions he was about to take. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose 15 years of bad decisions and wrong thinking. And it all started with Rick's assumption that someone didn't belong somewhere, based on nothing more than the color of their skin. Rick knocked on the driver's window with his knuckles harder than he needed to. The sound echoed in the quiet parking lot. Inside the BMW, the driver pressed a button and the window rolled down smoothly. The man behind the wheel was probably in his early 40s, wearing a crisp navy suit and a silver watch that caught the light from the restaurant's neon sign. "Evening," the driver said calmly. His voice was steady, professional, the kind of voice you'd hear in a boardroom or courtroom, but Rick had already made up his mind about what kind of person this was. "License and registration," Rick demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. He positioned himself so he was looking down at the driver, using his height to create intimidation. It was a tactic he'd learned early in his career, and he used it often. The driver nodded and slowly reached toward his jacket pocket. "I'm reaching for my wallet," he said clearly, making sure Rick could see every movement. This level of caution told Rick that this man had been pulled over before, which only confirmed his suspicions. "Yeah, I can see that," Rick said with irritation in his voice. "Just hurry up." The driver pulled out a leather wallet and carefully removed his license. Then he reached across to the glove compartment, again announcing his movements. "Getting my registration from the glove box." His movements were deliberate and slow, the kind of careful behavior that came from experience with situations like this. Rick took the documents and studied them under his flashlight. The name on the license was David Chen. The address matched one of the most expensive streets in Riverside Heights. The registration showed the BMW was properly licensed and up to date. Everything was legitimate, which frustrated Rick more than it should have. "So David," Rick said, emphasizing the name like he didn't believe it was real, "what brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" David looked up at Rick with calm eyes. "I live here, officer, and I'm meeting someone for dinner." He gestured toward Romano's restaurant. "Is there a problem?" Rick felt his jaw tighten. The respectful tone, the proper answers, it all felt like an act to him. In his mind, people like David were always trying to pull something over on him. "We'll see about that. Step out of the vehicle. Can I ask why?" David's voice remained calm, but Rick could hear a slight edge to it now. "I wasn't speeding and all my documents are in order." This question made Rick angry. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone he'd already decided was suspicious. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Step out of the car, now." David took a slow breath and unbuckled his seatbelt. As he opened the door and stepped out, Rick could see he was tall and well-built, probably someone who worked out regularly. The suit was expensive, Rick could tell by the way it fit. Everything about David suggested success and education, but Rick's prejudices twisted these positive traits into something negative. "Put your hands on the hood," Rick ordered, even though he had no legal reason to search David or his vehicle. David complied, placing his palms flat on the warm metal of the BMW's hood. The parking lot lights cast long shadows, and a few people walking into the restaurant glanced over at the scene with curious expressions. Rick began patting down David's jacket and pants, searching for weapons or drugs he was sure weren't there. The search was more aggressive than necessary, designed to humiliate rather than ensure safety. David remained perfectly still throughout the process, his breathing steady and controlled. "Nice car," Rick said sarcastically as he continued the search. "Must have cost you a pretty penny." "What kind of work do you do, David?" "I work in law enforcement," David replied simply. Rick let out a harsh laugh. "Law enforcement? What, you're a security guard or something?" The idea that David might be a real police officer never crossed Rick's mind. In his world, people who looked like David didn't hold positions of authority in law enforcement. "Something like that," David said quietly. Rick finished the pat-down and stepped back. "Turn around." David did as he was told, now facing Rick directly. Under the parking lot lights, Rick could see that David's expression remained calm, almost patient. This annoyed Rick even more. He wanted to see fear, nervousness, the kind of reaction that would justify his actions. "So where'd you get the money for a car like this?" Rick pressed on. "Security guards don't usually drive BMWs. His tone was accusatory, implying that David must have obtained his wealth through illegal means. David's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign that Rick's words were getting to him. "I work hard for what I have, officer." "I bet you do," Rick said with a smirk. "Mind if I take a look inside your car? Make sure everything's on the up and up?" "Actually, I do mind," David said firmly. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle. I've been cooperative. I've provided all the documentation you requested, and I haven't violated any traffic laws." Rick's face reddened. He wasn't used to people knowing their rights, especially people he'd already decided were criminals. "Listen here, smart guy. I can make this easy or I can make this hard. Your choice." David reached slowly into his jacket pocket, making sure his movements were visible. "Officer, I'm going to show you something that might clear this up." He pulled out his phone and held it up so Rick could see the screen. "I'm recording this interaction for both our protection." The sight of the phone camera pointed at him made Rick even angrier. "Put that thing away. You can't record me without permission." "Actually, I can," David said calmly. "It's perfectly legal to record police officers in public spaces during the course of their duties. I'm sure you know that." Rick felt his control of the situation slipping away. The recording, David's knowledge of his rights, the calm way he was handling everything, it all made Rick feel foolish. And when Rick felt foolish, he usually got aggressive. "Listen, I don't know what game you're playing," Rick said, stepping closer to David. "But I've been doing this job for 15 years and I can spot trouble when I see it. And right now I'm looking at trouble." David shook his head slowly. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to get to dinner." "With who?" Rick demanded. "Who are you meeting?" "The mayor and the city council," David replied. "We're discussing some changes to city policies." Rick laughed again, louder this time. "The mayor? You expect me to believe that? What, you're going to tell me you're somebody important next?" David looked directly into Rick's eyes. "Officer Thompson," he said, reading the name tag on Rick's uniform. "I think this has gone far enough. I'm going to ask you one more time to let me go to my dinner. I haven't done anything wrong and you know it." The use of his name surprised Rick. Most people he pulled over were too nervous or intimidated to read his name tag. But David had not only read it, he'd said it with a tone that suggested familiarity with police procedures and protocols. "I'll decide when this is over," Rick said, but his voice lacked some of its earlier confidence. Something about David's demeanor was starting to make him uncomfortable. The man was too calm, too knowledgeable, too confident for someone who should have been intimidated by a police officer. But Rick had gone too far to back down now. His pride was on the line, and he'd never been good at admitting when he was wrong. So instead of ending the stop and letting David go to his dinner, Rick decided to push further. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, and he had no idea what was coming. Rick looked at David's expensive suit and the way he carried himself with such confidence. Everything about this man bothered him. The calm voice, the proper grammar, the way he knew his rights. It all felt like a challenge to Rick's authority. And Rick Thompson didn't like being challenged. "You know what?" Rick said, his voice getting louder. "I think I will take a look inside that fancy car of yours. Step aside." David remained where he was, his hands still visible and his posture non-threatening. "Officer Thompson, I've already told you that I don't consent to a search. You need either a warrant or probable cause. Probable cause. Rick scoffed. How about the fact that you don't belong in this neighborhood? How about the fact that you're acting suspicious? That's all the probable cause I need. David's expression remained calm, but Rick could see a flash of something in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe. Or sadness. Officer, being black in an expensive neighborhood isn't probable cause for anything. The words hung in the air between them. David had said out loud what they both knew was really happening here. Rick felt his face get hot with embarrassment and anger. He didn't like being called out, especially when he knew David was right. Don't try to make this about race, Rick snapped. This is about a suspicious person in an expensive car in a neighborhood where break-ins have been happening. What break-ins? David asked quietly. I live here and I haven't heard about any break-ins. Rick realized he'd made up the break-ins on the spot, but he wasn't about to admit that. That's police business. You don't need to know the details. A few more people had gathered near the restaurant entrance, watching the scene unfold. Rick could see them pointing and whispering to each other. Some had their phones out, probably recording. This made Rick even more agitated. He felt like he was being judged by people who didn't understand what police work was really like. Everyone mind your own business, Rick shouted toward the small crowd. Then he turned back to David. See what you've done? You've caused a scene. David glanced toward the onlookers, then back at Rick. Officer, I've been nothing but cooperative. You're the one who's escalating the situation. Rick moved closer to David, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate him. Listen here, buddy. I don't care how nice your suit is or how fancy your car is. I don't care if you think you're better than me. When I tell you to do something, you do it. That's how this works. I understand you're doing your job, David said, his voice still steady. But your job has limits, and you're exceeding those limits right now. Rick felt like David was lecturing him, treating him like a child who didn't know the rules. It reminded him of being in school, when teachers would talk down to him because he wasn't the smartest kid in class. All those old feelings of inadequacy came rushing back, and Rick did what he always did when he felt small. He got aggressive. Open the trunk, Rick demanded. Now. I'm not going to do that, David replied. You have no legal authority to make me open my trunk. Rick's hand moved to his belt near his handcuffs. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. What's it going to be? David noticed the gesture and sighed. Officer Thompson, I really think you should reconsider what you're doing here. This isn't going to end well for anyone. Is that a threat? Rick asked, his voice rising. Are you threatening a police officer? No, David said firmly. It's advice, from someone who understands how these situations work. Rick pulled out his handcuffs and held them where David could see them. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. David didn't move. What am I being arrested for? Resisting arrest and obstruction of justice, Rick said, though he knew both charges were bogus. David hadn't resisted anything. He'd been perfectly cooperative within the bounds of his rights. Officer, you can't arrest someone for resisting arrest if there was no legal reason to arrest them in the first place, David said. And I haven't obstructed anything. Rick's face was now bright red with frustration. This man knew too much about police procedures. Most people Rick dealt with didn't know their rights this well. They usually just did whatever he told them to do, even when he was overstepping his authority. You think you're real smart, don't you? Rick said. Think you know everything about police work? Well, let me tell you something. I've been doing this job since before you could afford your first suit. David looked at Rick with what appeared to be genuine concern. Officer, how long have you been with the department? 15 years, Rick said proudly.
15 years of keeping these streets safe from people like you. People like me?
David asked. What exactly do you mean by that? Rick realized he'd said too much, but he was too angry to stop now. You know exactly what I mean. People who think they can come into neighborhoods where they don't belong and act like they own the place. The crowd near the restaurant had grown larger. Rick could hear murmurs of disapproval from the onlookers. Someone called out, "Leave him alone. He wasn't doing anything wrong." Rick spun around and glared at the crowd. All of you get back inside. This is police business. When he turned back to David, he saw that the man was holding his phone again, making sure the screen was pointed toward Rick. The red recording light was clearly visible. Turn that off, Rick shouted. I told you to stop recording. And I told you that I have the right to record this interaction, David replied calmly. This is for both our protection. Rick lunged forward and tried to grab the phone, but David pulled it back quickly. "Don't touch my property, officer." "That's it," Rick yelled. "You're under arrest." He grabbed David's arm and tried to spin him around, but David remained planted where he was. "Officer Thompson," David said, his voice now carrying a tone of authority that Rick had never heard before. "I strongly advise you to stop what you're doing right now and call your supervisor." "My supervisor?" Rick laughed harshly. "What's my supervisor going to do? Tell me I did a good job getting a troublemaker off the streets?" David looked directly into Rick's eyes. "Your supervisor is going to ask you why you just arrested the new police commissioner." Rick froze. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. "What did you say?" "I said I'm the police commissioner," David repeated quietly. "I was appointed last month to reform this department. Tonight was supposed to be my first dinner meeting with the mayor and city council to discuss new policies and training programs." Rick's grip on David's arm loosened. "You're lying." David reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather credential case. He flipped it open to reveal a gold badge and an official identification card. Even in the dim parking lot light, Rick could see the words Police Commissioner clearly printed on the ID. Rick's hand dropped to his side. His mouth fell open. The blood drained from his face as the full weight of what had just happened hit him like a truck. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Rick stared at the badge and identification card in David's hands. The gold shield gleamed under the parking lot lights, and the official seal of the police department was clearly visible. But Rick's mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. "That's fake," Rick said, his voice shaky. "You bought that online or something. You can't fool me with some costume badge." David closed the credential case and put it back in his jacket pocket. "Officer Thompson, I understand this is shocking, but I assure you my credentials are very real. I was sworn in as police commissioner 3 weeks ago." Rick's mind raced. 3 weeks ago, he remembered there had been some talk around the station about a new commissioner being appointed. But Rick rarely paid attention to departmental politics. He just did his job, collected his paycheck, and went home. He certainly hadn't bothered to learn what the new commissioner looked like. "Even if that's true," Rick said, grasping for some way to justify his actions. "How was I supposed to know? You were driving around this neighborhood looking suspicious." David's expression remained patient, but Rick could see disappointment in his eyes. "Officer, what exactly did I do that was suspicious?" "I was driving the speed limit, obeying all traffic laws, and parking at a restaurant for a dinner meeting." Rick felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. You had tinted windows, and you were driving slowly like you were casing houses." "My windows are legally tinted," David replied, "and I was driving slowly because I was looking for the restaurant address. I've only lived in this neighborhood for 2 months." The crowd near Romano's had grown even larger. Rick could see people filming with their phones, and he knew this was going to be all over social media within hours. His stomach churned as he imagined his face on the evening news, identified as the cop who racially profiled his own police commissioner. "Look," Rick said, his voice becoming desperate. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we just forget this whole thing happened? I'll let you go to your dinner and we can pretend this never occurred." David shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, Officer Thompson. This interaction has been recorded by multiple people, including myself. And more importantly, this isn't just about what happened to me tonight. This is about what happens to other people when you make these same assumptions." Rick felt panic rising in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this isn't the first time you've pulled someone over based on racial profiling, is it?" David's voice was calm but firm. "This is just the first time you've done it to someone who has the authority to hold you accountable." Rick's mouth went dry. He thought about all the other traffic stops he'd made over the years, all the times he'd followed cars simply because the driver didn't look like they belonged in certain neighborhoods, all the aggressive searches and hostile questioning he'd done without proper justification. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rick said weakly. "I treat everyone fairly." David pulled out his phone and showed Rick the screen. The recording was still running, and Rick could see the timestamp showing that David had been filming for over 20 minutes. 20 minutes of Rick's worst behavior, all captured in high definition. "The recording tells a different story," David said, "and I imagine if we look at your history of traffic stops, we'll find a pattern." Rick's knees felt weak. He knew David was right. If anyone bothered to analyze his arrest records, they would see that he stopped Black and Hispanic drivers at a much higher rate than white drivers. They would see that he searched vehicles without probable cause far more often when the driver was a person of color. "Commissioner," Rick said, the title feeling strange on his tongue. I made a mistake tonight, but I'm a good cop. I've served this community for 15 years. Have you?" David asked quietly. "Have you really served this community? Or have you spent 15 years harassing innocent people based on their race?" Rick looked around desperately as if searching for someone to help him out of this situation. But the crowd was clearly on David's side. He could hear people talking angrily about what they'd witnessed. "This is exactly what's wrong with the police," someone called out from the crowd. "That cop should be fired," another voice added. Rick felt like the world was closing in on him. His career, his pension, his reputation, everything was crumbling around him because of one traffic stop. One decision to pull over a car based on nothing more than the color of the driver's skin. "What happens now?" Rick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Now you're going to learn what accountability looks like. I'm going to file a formal complaint against you. Internal Affairs will investigate your conduct tonight and review your entire service record. And if they find what I think they're going to find, you'll be facing serious consequences." Rick felt tears forming in his eyes. "My wife. My kids. This job is all I know. It's all I've ever done." "You should have thought about that before you decided to harass an innocent person," David replied. "Actions have consequences, Officer Thompson. And your actions tonight were inexcusable." A black sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped near them. Rick could see several people in suits getting out of the car. Even from a distance, he recognized the mayor from pictures he'd seen in the newspaper. "Those are the people I'm supposed to be having dinner with," David said. "The mayor, 3 city council members, and the head of the police union. We were going to discuss new training programs to prevent exactly this kind of incident." Rick watched as the group approached. The mayor looked confused and concerned as he took in the scene. A police officer standing next to a black man with a crowd of onlookers and multiple phones recording everything. "David?" The mayor called out as he got closer. "What's going on here?" "Just a minor delay, Mayor Johnson," David replied. "Officer Thompson here decided to pull me over for driving while black in Riverside Heights." The mayor's face went pale as he understood what had happened. The city council members looked shocked and embarrassed. The head of the police union, a man Rick had met several times at department functions, wouldn't even make eye contact with him. "Officer Thompson," the police union representative said formally, "I think you need to contact a lawyer tonight." Rick felt his world completely fall apart. Even his own union representative was distancing himself from what had happened. There would be no support, no backing, no one willing to defend his actions. As the group headed toward the restaurant, leaving Rick standing alone in the parking lot, he realized that his 15-year career was effectively over. One traffic stop, one moment of letting his prejudices override his judgment, had destroyed everything he'd worked for. But the worst part was knowing that David was right. This wasn't really about one traffic stop. This was about years of similar behavior that had finally caught up with him. And now, for the first time in his career, he was going to face real consequences for his actions. Rick stood frozen in the parking lot, watching as David walked toward the restaurant with the mayor and city officials. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in, but his mind kept trying to reject it. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening to him. His radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, what's your status?" It was dispatch, probably wondering why he'd been at the same location for so long without reporting anything. Rick picked up his radio with shaking hands. "Unit 47? He stopped. What was he supposed to say? That he'd just racially profiled and harassed the police commissioner? That his career was probably over? "Unit 47, please respond," the dispatcher said again. I'm going to need a supervisor," Rick finally managed to say. "Is there an emergency, Officer Thompson?" Rick looked toward the restaurant where he could see David through the windows, sitting at a table with the mayor and the other officials. Even from outside, Rick could see that they were having a serious conversation. Probably about him. "No emergency," Rick said into his radio. "Just send Sergeant Wilson when he's available." Rick knew that within minutes word would spread throughout the department. Police departments were like small towns. News traveled fast, especially bad news. By tomorrow morning, every cop in the city would know about Officer Rick Thompson and his spectacular mistake. Rick's phone buzzed. He looked down to see a text message from his partner Jake, who was off duty tonight. "Dude, are you okay? Someone just sent me a video of you on Facebook." Rick's heart sank even further. The videos were already online. He clicked on the link Jake had sent and watched in horror as he saw himself on a phone screen, demanding that David step out of his car, searching him without cause, making accusations based on nothing but prejudice. The video had been posted 20 minutes ago, and already had hundreds of views and dozens of comments. Rick scrolled through them, each one making him feel worse than the last. "This cop is a disgrace. Fire him immediately. This is exactly why people don't trust police. I hope this guy loses his job." Rick put his phone away and sat down on the hood of his patrol car. His head was spinning. 15 years of service, and it was all going to end because of one night. One decision. One moment when he let his worst instincts take control. But even as he sat there feeling sorry for himself, a small voice in the back of his mind was asking uncomfortable questions. How many other people had he treated this way over the years? How many innocent people had he harassed, searched, and intimidated simply because they didn't look like they belonged somewhere? Rick thought about Anthony Williams, a black teenager he'd stopped last month for walking suspiciously through Riverside Heights. The kid had been carrying art supplies and said he was going to draw in the park, but Rick had made him empty his backpack and questioned him for 20 minutes before letting him go. He thought about Maria Gonzalez, a Hispanic woman he'd pulled over 6 months ago for driving erratically, even though she'd been driving perfectly normally. He'd made her wait on the side of the road for 45 minutes while he ran every possible check on her license and registration, hoping to find something wrong. He thought about dozens of other stops over the years, all involving people of color, all based on his assumptions about who belonged where and who looked suspicious. At the time, he'd told himself he was just being thorough, just doing his job. But now, sitting in this parking lot after what had just happened, he was beginning to understand what he'd really been doing. A white patrol car pulled into the parking lot. Rick could see Sergeant Wilson behind the wheel, his face grim. Wilson was a good supervisor, fair but strict, and Rick had always respected him. But as Wilson approached, Rick could see disappointment in his eyes. "Thompson," Wilson said as he got out of his car. "What happened here?" Rick stood up slowly. "Sarge, I made a mistake." Wilson looked toward the restaurant where David was still visible through the windows. "Is that David Chen?" "You know him?" Rick asked, surprised. "I was at his swearing-in ceremony 3 weeks ago," Wilson said flatly. "He's the new police commissioner. And according to the reports I'm getting, you just pulled him over and harassed him for no reason." Rick felt his legs go weak. "I didn't know who he was." "That's not the point, Thompson," Wilson said, his voice getting harder. "The point is that you pulled over an innocent man and treated him like a criminal, based on nothing but your own prejudices." Rick wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. Everything Wilson was saying was true. "Do you understand what you've done?" Wilson continued. "Do you understand the position you've put this entire department in? We've been working for years to build trust with the community, and you've just destroyed months of progress in one night." Rick looked down at his feet. "What happens now?" Wilson sighed heavily. "Now you're going to drive back to the station, turn in your badge and gun, and wait for internal affairs to contact you. You're suspended pending investigation, effective immediately." The words hit Rick like a physical blow. Suspended. He'd never been suspended in 15 years of service. He'd had a few reprimands, a couple of minor disciplinary actions, but never anything like this. "For how long?" Rick asked. "However long it takes," Wilson replied. "And Thompson? Get yourself a lawyer. A good one. Because this isn't going away quietly." Rick nodded numbly. He walked back to his patrol car, feeling like he was in a dream. A nightmare, really. Everything felt surreal and distant, like he was watching someone else's life fall apart. As he drove back to the station, Rick passed other patrol cars on the street. He wondered if the officers inside had already heard what happened. He wondered if they were talking about him on their radios, sharing the news of his spectacular downfall. At the station, Rick mechanically went through the process of turning in his equipment. His badge, his gun, his radio, his body camera, all the tools of his trade, handed over to a desk sergeant who couldn't quite meet his eyes. As Rick walked out of the police station in civilian clothes for what might be the last time, his phone rang. It was his wife, Linda. "Rick, I just saw something on the news about a police officer in Riverside Heights. They didn't show your face, but the car number looked like yours. Please tell me that wasn't you." Rick sat in his personal car in the station parking lot and closed his eyes. "Linda, I need to come home. We need to talk." The silence on the other end of the line told him that she already knew. "Oh God, Rick, what did you do?" "I ruined everything," he said quietly. "I ruined absolutely everything." As Rick drove home to face his family and explain how he destroyed their financial security and his career in one evening, he knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation, the media attention, the legal proceedings, it was all going to get much worse before it got better. And the worst part was knowing that he had no one to blame but himself. By the time Rick got home, the story was everywhere. His wife Linda was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked up at him as he walked in, and Rick could see the mixture of disappointment and fear in her expression. "It's all over Facebook," she said quietly. "The video has been shared thousands of times already. People are calling for you to be fired." Rick sat down heavily across from her. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. This was the same table where they'd eaten breakfast that morning, where everything had been normal. Now it felt like a different world entirely. "How bad is it?" Rick asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Linda turned the laptop around so he could see the screen. The video was playing on the local news website, with the headline, "Police Officer Racially Profiles New Police Commissioner." The news anchor was talking about the incident, and Rick watched himself on camera, seeing his own actions from the outside for the first time. It was worse than he'd imagined. Watching himself demand that David step out of the car, seeing the aggressive way he'd conducted the search, hearing his own voice making accusations and threats, it all looked exactly like what it was. A racist cop abusing his power. "Rick," Linda said, her voice shaking, "the phone has been ringing all evening. Reporters want to talk to you. Our neighbors are asking questions and—" She took a shaky breath. "Your boss called. He said not to talk to anyone and to get a lawyer immediately." Rick's phone buzzed with another notification. He'd turned off most of his social media alerts, but the news apps were still sending him updates. Each notification felt like a punch to the gut. "What about the kids?" Rick asked. Their two children, Emma and Tyler, were teenagers, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be embarrassed by their father's actions. Emma locked herself in her room. Linda said, "Her friends have been texting her about the video all night. And Tyler, he just keeps asking if you're going to jail." Rick felt a wave of shame wash over him. His children were going to pay the price for his mistakes. They'd have to face their classmates, their teachers, their friends, all of whom would know that their father was the racist cop from the viral video. The doorbell rang, making both of them jump. Through the front window, Rick could see a news van parked on the street. A reporter with a camera crew was standing on his front porch. "Don't answer it," Linda said quickly. "The lawyer said not to talk to anyone." They sat in silence, listening to the reporter knocking and calling out, "Officer Thompson? We'd like to get your side of the story." After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, but Rick could see through the curtains that the news van was still there. Rick's phone rang. It was Jake, his partner. "Rick, man, are you okay?" Jake's voice sounded strained. "I can't believe this is happening." "I'm hanging in there," Rick lied. "What's the word at the station?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "It's not good, buddy. The chief called an emergency meeting. Internal Affairs is opening a full investigation. And word is they're going to review all your traffic stops from the past 5 years." Rick's stomach dropped. 5 years of traffic stops. 5 years of questionable decisions and racial profiling that he'd thought no one would ever notice. "And Rick," Jake continued, "I hate to tell you this, but the union rep says they probably can't help you with this one. The video is too clear. They can't defend what's on camera." Rick ended the call and looked at Linda. Even his own union was abandoning him. The organization that was supposed to protect officers no matter what was walking away because his actions were too obvious, too damaging to defend. Over the next few hours, Rick watched his life unravel in real time. The video was picked up by national news networks. Social media was exploding with commentary about police racism and accountability. His name was trending on Twitter, and not for good reasons. The local NACP released a statement calling for Rick's immediate termination. The police reform organization that David had been working with issued a press release saying this incident proved why the department needed new leadership and training. Linda showed him an article in the online newspaper. "Listen to this," she said, reading from the screen. Police Commissioner David Chen, who was the victim of the racial profiling incident, released a statement saying, "This unfortunate event highlights exactly why we need comprehensive reform in our police department. Officer Thompson's actions represent the kind of biased policing that has damaged community trust for too long." Rick winced. Even David's official statement was measured and professional, which somehow made it worse. The man could have destroyed Rick with angry words, but instead he'd used the incident as a teaching moment about police reform. "Dad?" A small voice came from the doorway. It was Tyler, their 16-year-old son. His eyes were red and he looked like he'd been crying. "Yeah, buddy?" Rick said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Some kids at school are saying you're going to prison. Are you?" Rick looked at Linda, then back at his son. "I don't know, Tyler. I made a really big mistake, and now there are going to be consequences. But whatever happens, I want you to know that what I did was wrong. It was completely wrong." Tyler nodded slowly. "Will you lose your job?" "Probably," Rick said honestly. "And we might have to make some changes. Money might be tight for a while." Emma appeared in the doorway behind Tyler. She was 18, about to start college in the fall. "Dad, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." Rick nodded. "Have you done this before? To other people?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Rick looked at his daughter, seeing the intelligence and moral clarity in her eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. He could lie, try to make this seem like an isolated incident, but the investigation was going to reveal the truth anyway. "Yes," he said quietly. "I have." Emma's face crumpled. "Dad, how could you?" Rick didn't have a good answer. "I don't know. I convinced myself I was just doing my job, but I was wrong. I've been wrong for a long time." That night, Rick lay awake staring at the ceiling while Linda slept fitfully beside him. Outside, he could still see the glow of the news van's lights. His phone continued to buzz with notifications, messages from reporters, angry comments from strangers who'd seen the video. He thought about David Chen, probably at home with his own family, dealing with the aftermath of what should have been a simple dinner meeting. Rick wondered if David had children, if they were asking him questions about why a police officer had treated their father so badly. Rick realized that in 15 years of police work, he'd never really thought about the people he'd pulled over as human beings with families and lives and dignity. He'd seen them as problems to be solved, threats to be neutralized, suspects to be investigated. He'd never considered that his actions might affect innocent people, might traumatize someone who was just trying to live their life. As the hours passed and dawn approached, Rick began to understand that losing his job was probably the least of his problems. The investigation would likely uncover years of civil rights violations. There could be federal charges, lawsuits from people he'd wrongfully stopped and searched. His 15-year career wasn't just ending, it was becoming evidence of a pattern of misconduct that could land him in prison. And for the first time in his adult life, Rick Thompson began to understand that actions really do have consequences, especially when those actions hurt innocent people based on nothing more than the color of their skin. 3 days after the incident, Rick received a call that changed everything. Detective Sarah Collins from Internal Affairs was at his door with a stack of papers and a grim expression. Rick had known Sarah for years. She was thorough, fair, and absolutely relentless when it came to investigating police misconduct. "Rick," she said as he led her into his living room. "We need to talk." Linda brought coffee and then quietly left them alone. Sarah spread several folders across the coffee table, each one thick with documents and reports. "We've been reviewing your service record," Sarah began, "and what we've found is concerning." Rick's mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" Sarah opened the first folder. "In the past 5 years, you've made 847 traffic stops. Of those stops, 623 involved drivers who were Black, Hispanic, or other minorities. That's 73% of your stops involving people of color, in a district where minorities make up only 31% of the population." The numbers hit Rick like a sledgehammer. He'd never thought about it in statistical terms before. but seeing it laid out in black and white made his pattern of behavior undeniable. Furthermore, Sarah continued, opening another folder, you conducted vehicle searches in 45% of stops involving minority drivers, compared to just 8% of stops involving white drivers. And in 89% of those searches, nothing illegal was found. Rick slumped back in his chair. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of racial profiling documented in his own reports and arrest records. There's more, Sarah said, pulling out a thick stack of papers. We've also found 17 formal complaints filed against you over the past 5 years. Complaints that were either dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary action. We're reopening all of them. Rick remembered some of those complaints. At the time, he'd dismissed them as criminals trying to cause trouble for him. Now he was starting to see them differently. Rick, I have to ask you directly, Sarah said, looking him in the eyes. Did you systematically target minority drivers based on their race? Rick sat in silence for a long moment. He could lie, claim it was all coincidence, try to fight the evidence. But the numbers were clear and he was tired of lying to himself. Yes, he said quietly. I did. Sarah nodded and made a note in her file. The FBI is opening a federal civil rights investigation. They'll be contacting you soon. Rick felt his world shrink even smaller. Federal charges meant serious prison time. It meant his mistakes weren't just going to cost him his job. They could cost him years of his life. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded beyond anything Rick had imagined. The FBI interviewed dozens of people he'd stopped over the years. Local civil rights lawyers began reaching out to his former victims, offering to represent them in lawsuits against Rick and the department. The media attention was relentless. Rick's face was on every local news channel, and the story had been picked up by national outlets as an example of systemic racism in police departments across the country. His family couldn't leave the house without being followed by reporters. One evening, Linda sat down next to Rick on the couch and handed him a letter. This came today, she said. Rick opened it and saw it was from their mortgage company. Due to his loss of income and the negative publicity, they were being foreclosed on. They had 30 days to bring their payments current or lose their house. We can't afford the payments without your salary, Linda said, tears in her eyes. And with all the legal bills coming, we're going broke. Rick looked around the living room where his children had grown up, where his family had built their life together. Everything was falling apart because of his actions. Emma came home from school that day in tears. Dad, I can't go back there, she said. Everyone knows who I am. They're calling me the racist cop's daughter. Some people won't even talk to me anymore. Tyler was having his own problems. He'd gotten into a fight at school when someone made a comment about his father. Now he was suspended, and Rick realized his son was going to carry the shame of his father's actions for years to come. The legal proceedings moved quickly. The district attorney filed charges of civil rights violations and abuse of power. The FBI's investigation uncovered evidence of Rick's pattern of misconduct, going back even further than Internal Affairs had initially found. Rick's lawyer, a tired-looking man named Bill Henderson, delivered the news bluntly. Rick, they have you dead to rights. The video evidence, the statistical analysis of your stops, your own admission to Internal Affairs. It's an airtight case. We need to start thinking about a plea deal. What kind of plea deal? Rick asked. 3 to 5 years in federal prison, full restitution to your victims, and you can never work in law enforcement again. Rick felt the room spin around him. Prison. His children would visit him behind bars. His wife would have to rebuild their life while he was locked up. But even worse than the personal consequences was the growing realization of how many people he'd hurt over the years. The FBI had identified 43 individuals who had been victims of Rick's racial profiling. 43 people who had been humiliated, frightened, and violated by his abuse of power. One of those people was Anthony Williams, the teenager Rick had stopped for walking suspiciously through Riverside Heights. Anthony's mother contacted the FBI and described how her son had come home that day shaken and scared, convinced that police officers would always see him as a threat no matter what he did. Another was Maria Gonzalez, the Hispanic woman Rick had detained for 45 minutes while searching for violations that didn't exist. She told investigators that the experience had made her afraid to drive through certain neighborhoods, limiting where she could work and shop. As Rick read through the victim impact statements, he began to understand the real cost of his actions. It wasn't just about traffic stops or searches. It was about terrorizing innocent people, making them feel unwelcome in their own communities, teaching their children that police officers couldn't be trusted. The department moved quickly to distance itself from Rick. Chief Williams held a press conference announcing new training programs and accountability measures. The police union issued a statement condemning Rick's actions and supporting reform efforts. Most painfully for Rick, several of his fellow officers publicly criticized his behavior. Jake, his former partner, gave an interview saying that he'd always been uncomfortable with some of Rick's stops but hadn't spoken up. Other officers came forward with stories of Rick making racist comments and jokes. 6 months after that night in the Romano's parking lot, Rick stood in federal court to enter his plea. He looked out at the gallery and saw some of his victims there, watching as justice was finally served. David Chen was there too, sitting quietly in the back row. When their eyes met, Rick saw no anger or satisfaction in the commissioner's face, just sadness and a kind of weary determination to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen to anyone else. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said, "how do you plead to the charges of civil rights violations and abuse of power under color of law?" Rick looked at his family in the front row, Linda crying quietly, Emma staring at the floor, Tyler looking confused and scared. Then he looked at the people he'd wronged, the victims of his prejudice and misconduct. "Guilty, Your Honor," Rick said, his voice barely audible. "I plead guilty to all charges." As the judge scheduled his sentencing hearing, Rick realized that this courtroom confession was just the beginning. The real work of taking responsibility for his actions and trying to make amends for the harm he'd caused would take the rest of his life. 2 years later, Rick Thompson walked out of federal prison a changed man. The medium security facility had been his home for 24 months, during which he'd had plenty of time to think about the choices that had brought him there. He was 48 years old, unemployable in law enforcement and facing a world that had moved on without him. Linda was waiting for him at the prison gates, but things between them were different now. They'd stayed married, but the relationship had been tested in ways Rick never could have imagined. The financial stress, the public humiliation, and the knowledge of what kind of man she'd been married to had changed everything. "The kids are waiting at home," Linda said as they drove away from the prison. "But Rick, they're different now. This whole experience has changed them." Rick nodded. He'd seen the changes during their visits. Emma had deferred college for a year to help support the family financially. She worked 2 jobs and had become serious and driven in a way that made Rick both proud and heartbroken. The carefree teenager he'd known was gone, replaced by a young woman who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. Tyler, now 18, had struggled more. He'd been in counseling for anger issues and had difficulty trusting authority figures. The shame of having a father in prison had isolated him from his friends and affected his grades. Rick knew his son would carry these scars for years. Their small apartment was a far cry from the house they'd lost to foreclosure. Rick looked around at the cramped space and secondhand furniture, knowing that his family had paid the price for his mistakes in ways that went far beyond money. But Rick's punishment was only part of a much larger story that had unfolded during his time in prison. David Chen had used the incident as a catalyst for comprehensive police reform that had transformed the entire department. The new training program required all officers to complete 40 hours of bias awareness and de-escalation training every year. Body cameras became mandatory for all police interactions. A civilian oversight board was established to review complaints against officers, taking that responsibility away from internal affairs. Most importantly, David had implemented a new data tracking system that monitored every officer's traffic stops by race, location, and outcome. Any officer whose statistics showed patterns similar to Rick's was immediately flagged for additional training and supervision. The changes had been controversial within the department. Some older officers resented the additional oversight and training requirements. A few had even resigned rather than adapt to the new standards. But the results were undeniable. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%, and community trust in the police had begun to improve. Rick learned about these changes through newspaper articles that other inmates shared with him. David Chen had become something of a national figure, speaking at conferences and helping other cities implement similar reforms. The incident in Romano's parking lot had become a case study taught in police academies across the country. 3 months after his release, Rick received an unexpected phone call. It was Anthony Williams, the teenager he'd stopped and harassed 2 years earlier. "Mr. Thompson?" Anthony's voice was deeper now, more mature. "I heard you got out of prison. I wanted to talk to you." Rick's heart pounded. "Anthony, I owe you an apology. What I did to you was wrong. Completely wrong, I know," Anthony said. "And I appreciate you saying that. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm starting college next month, studying criminal justice. I want to become a police officer." Rick was stunned. "After what I did to you?" "Because of what you did to me," Anthony replied. "I realized that the only way to change things is to be part of the change. Commissioner Chen spoke at my high school last year, and he told us that we need good people to join law enforcement, people who understand what it feels like to be on the other side of police misconduct." The conversation lasted an hour. Anthony told Rick about his plans to study criminal justice and eventually join the police force. He talked about wanting to be the kind of officer who protected people instead of harassing them. "I don't forgive you for what you did," Anthony said honestly, "but I understand that you were a product of a system that didn't teach you better. Now that system is changing, and I want to be part of making sure it keeps changing." After the call ended, Rick sat in silence for a long time. The young man he'd traumatized was now planning to become a police officer, motivated partly by his desire to prevent other people from experiencing what Rick had put him through. Rick found work at a community center in the part of town where he'd grown up. The pay was minimal, but the work was meaningful. He helped coordinate programs for at-risk youth, many of whom had negative experiences with law enforcement. His own story became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale about how prejudice and abuse of power could destroy lives. Linda eventually found better work as a school administrator. Emma finished college and became a social worker, drawn to the profession by her family's experience with the justice system. Tyler struggled more but eventually found his way, becoming an advocate for criminal justice reform. 5 years after his release from prison, Rick was invited to speak at a police academy graduation. David Chen had recommended him as someone who could provide a unique perspective on the consequences of police misconduct. Standing before a class of new officers, Rick looked out at faces that reminded him of his younger self, eager, confident, ready to serve and protect. But he also saw something different in their eyes. They were products of the new training system that David had implemented. They'd learned about implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community policing in ways that Rick never had. "I was a police officer for 15 years, Rick began, "and I thought I was good at my job. I thought I was protecting my community. But the truth is I was terrorizing innocent people based on nothing more than the color of their skin." He told them about the night he pulled over David Chen, about the investigation that followed, about the families he'd harmed and the community trust he'd destroyed. He talked about prison, about losing everything, about the long process of understanding the real impact of his actions. "You have a choice to make every day," Rick concluded. "You can be the kind of officer who protects and serves everyone equally, or you can be the kind of officer who abuses their power and destroys lives. I made the wrong choice for 15 years and it cost me everything. Don't make the same mistakes I did." After his speech, a young black woman in the graduating class approached him. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "My brother was stopped by an officer like you were when he was 16. It traumatized him for years. But knowing that departments are changing, that officers like you are being held accountable, it gives me hope that I can be part of the solution." Rick realized that his story had become bigger than just his own redemption. It had become a symbol of the possibility for change, proof that even the worst mistakes could lead to positive transformation, if people were willing to face the truth and work for something better. David Chen's reforms had spread to police departments across the country. The incident that had destroyed Rick's life had also sparked a movement that was making policing more fair and just for everyone. As Rick drove home that evening, he thought about the long journey from that night in Romano's parking lot to this moment. He'd lost his career, his reputation, his freedom, and nearly his family. But somehow, through all that loss, something good had emerged. The system was changing. Young officers were being trained better. Communities were beginning to trust police again, and people like Anthony Williams were joining law enforcement with the goal of making it better. Rick knew he could never undo the harm he'd caused to the 43 people he'd victimized over the years. But maybe, just maybe, his story could help prevent other officers from making the same mistakes. Maybe the worst night of his life could eventually save someone else from experiencing what his victims had endured. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Rick understood that some mistakes couldn't be fully redeemed. But it was purpose, and for a man who had lost everything, purpose was enough to build a new life on.